Silence has a way of filling a room louder than anger ever could. And on that quiet evening, it wrapped itself around Keanu Reeves like a second skin. The studio lights were still warm from the interview that had ended moments earlier, yet something cold lingered in the air. Something unfinished. Sandra Bullock noticed it before anyone else did. The way Keanu's eyes drifted away instead of meeting hers. The way his hands folded together, as if you were holding back words that carried too much weight. The audience had laughed minutes ago, the host had smiled, the cameras had stopped rolling, but now the truth of the moment stood exposed in the quiet space between them. Sandra took a small step forward, expecting a familiar warmth, a reassuring comment, something, anything that would anchor her. Instead, she was met with silence. And in that silence, a question began to form that she was suddenly afraid to ask. They had shared decades of history, moments etched into public memory and private conversations that never made headlines. Their friendship had always been easy, built on trust and mutual respect, the kind that didn't demand constant explanation. Yet that night, Keanu's stillness felt different. It wasn't indifference, it wasn't avoidance, it was restraint. And Sandra could sense it with a clarity that made her chest tighten. She smiled, as she always did, brushing it off with humor, but when Keanu didn't respond in kind, the smile slowly faded. The silence stretched, and for the first time in years, she felt like she was standing on unfamiliar ground with someone she thought she knew completely. What the world never saw was how deeply Keanu felt moments like these. He had learned long ago that words, once released, could never be taken back, and sometimes silence was his way of protecting everyone involved, including himself. He carried memories quietly, grief quietly, love quietly. But that night, his quiet became a mirror, reflecting something Sandra wasn't prepared to face. She searched his face for reassurance, for the kindness she had always associated with him. But what she found instead was distance, not emotional distance, but a boundary, carefully placed, deliberately maintained. It was that boundary that made her step back, not physically at first, but emotionally, as if her heart had instinctively recognized a line that should not be crossed. The tension did not explode, it simmered, which made it far more powerful. Sandra laughed softly, making a light comment about needing coffee, giving herself a reason to move away. Keanu nodded, polite, gentle, but still silent. The moment passed for everyone else, but for her, it lingered like an unfinished sentence. As she walked down the hallway, the echo of her heels against the floor felt louder than the applause she'd received earlier. She replayed the interaction again and again, wondering what she had missed, what had changed, and why the absence of words felt heavier than any argument they'd ever had. Across town, in a quieter space away from cameras and expectations, Alexandra Grant was arranging books on a wooden shelf, unaware that the evening had subtly shifted the emotional balance of three lives intertwined by respect, misunderstanding, and unspoken truth. Alexandra understood Keanu in a way few people ever could. She knew that his silence was never empty. It was filled with consideration, responsibility, and a deep desire not to harm anyone with careless expression. Yet even she sensed that something was coming, something unresolved, something that would eventually demand words no matter how long they were held back. Sandra spent that night alone, staring out at the city lights from her hotel window, the glass reflecting her own expression back at her, calm on the surface, conflicted beneath. She wasn't angry, she wasn't hurt in a dramatic way. What unsettled her was the realization that silence could redraw boundaries without warning. She respected Keanu too much to confront him impulsively, but the question gnawed at her. Had she mistaken comfort for closeness, familiarity for permission? That thought humbled her, forcing her to examine her own assumptions in the quiet spaces she had never thought to question before. Meanwhile, Keanu sat in his car long after everyone else had left, hands resting on the steering wheel, eyes unfocused. He knew Sandra would feel the shift. He had counted on her emotional intelligence to sense it without explanation. Yet knowing didn't make it easier. He believed deeply in kindness, in humility, in choosing restraint over reaction. But even virtues came with consequences. His silence had protected one truth while quietly unsettling another, and he accepted that responsibility fully. He wasn't running from the moment, he was preparing himself for what would eventually follow, when words would be necessary and honesty unavoidable. This was not a story about betrayal or rejection, it was about respect. Respect strong enough to create distance rather than confusion. Respect that refused to blur lines for the sake of comfort. The silence that made Sandra step back was not meant to push her away, but to prevent something more painful from forming. Still, intentions did not erase impact, and part one of this story ends not with resolution, but with reflection. Three people standing at different points of the same emotional crossroads, each unaware how deeply the next conversation would change them. Because silence, when chosen carefully, does not end a story, it begins one. The morning arrived without answers, and that absence followed Sandra Bullock like a shadow she could not shake. Sunlight poured through the tall hotel windows, bright and unapologetic, yet it did nothing to soften the weight that had settled in her chest overnight. She moved through her routine with practiced ease, coffee untouched, phone checked and set aside, reflections avoided in the mirror because stillness gave her too much room to think. What unsettled her most was not the silence itself, but how deeply it had affected her, as though a single quiet moment had reached back through years of shared laughter and mutual respect and gently asked her to reconsider how she understood that history. She prided herself on emotional intelligence, on reading rooms and people, yet this silence had caught her off guard, not as rejection, but as something far more complex and humbling. Across the city, Keanu Reeves walked slowly through a quiet park, hands tucked into his coat pockets, footsteps measured and deliberate. He had always believed that reflection was not something to be rushed, that clarity arrived only when one allowed discomfort to sit long enough to reveal its purpose. The night before had not been accidental nor careless. His silence had been a choice born from restraint, shaped by years of learning that good intentions could still create unintended consequences if not guided by responsibility. He knew Sandra would feel the shift, and he trusted her strength to process it with grace. Yet that trust did not absolve him of the ache that came with knowing he had caused her to step back, even if stepping back was necessary. What neither of them realized yet was how that moment had begun to ripple outward, quietly touching every interaction that followed. At a scheduled charity meeting later that afternoon, the atmosphere was polite, professional, and subtly strained. Sandra arrived composed, her smile warm but more guarded than usual, her words thoughtful yet careful, as if each sentence passed through an internal filter before being released. When Keanu entered the room moments later, he acknowledged her with the same gentle respect he always had, but the ease that once defined their exchanges was missing, replaced by a mutual awareness that something unspoken now stood between them. Others in the room sensed it without understanding it, mistaking it for fatigue or distraction, unaware that they were witnessing the early stages of an emotional recalibration. For Sandra, the conflict was internal and deeply personal. She was not entitled to explanations, she reminded herself, nor was she owed emotional reassurance simply because of familiarity. Yet the human part of her, the part that valued honesty and connection, struggled with the idea that silence could be both kind and distancing at the same time. She replayed the moment again, not to assign blame, but to understand herself within it. Why had she expected words? Why had their absence unsettled her so profoundly? The answers did not come easily, but the questions themselves began to soften her perspective, shifting her focus from what she felt denied to what she might have misunderstood. Meanwhile, Keanu carried a parallel struggle, one rooted in responsibility rather than confusion. He believed deeply in humility, in never assuming that his presence or past bonds granted him the right to emotional shortcuts. Silence to him was not avoidance, but protection. Protection of clarity, of respect, of boundaries that once crossed could not be easily restored. Still, he was not immune to doubt. He wondered whether his restraint had been too sharp, whether kindness sometimes required explanation rather than quiet. Yet every time he considered reaching out prematurely, he stopped himself, understanding that timing mattered as much as intention. Words spoken too early could confuse rather than heal. As evening approached, Sandra chose solitude over distraction, retreating to a quiet space where she could think without interruption. She wrote in a notebook, not for publication, not for anyone else's eyes, but for herself, allowing thoughts to surface honestly. She wrote about respect, about the subtle difference between closeness and assumption, about how easily good intentions could blur lines when left unexamined. In doing so, she felt something shift inside her, a quiet acceptance replacing the unease. The silence had not diminished her, it had invited her to grow, to recognize that stepping back did not always mean being pushed away, but sometimes meant being given room to stand on one's own clarity. Elsewhere, Alexandra Grant listened carefully as Keanu spoke in measured tones about the previous night, offering neither dramatization nor self-justification. Alexandra understood that moments like these were not about choosing sides, but about honoring truth with compassion. She did not urge him to explain himself immediately, nor did she minimize the impact of his silence. Instead, she reminded him gently that respect was not only about restraint, but also about readiness to speak when the moment required it, even if doing so felt uncomfortable. Her words did not pressure him, they grounded him, reinforcing the balance he had always tried to maintain between humility and honesty. By the end of the day, nothing had been resolved on the surface, yet everything had begun to change beneath it. The silence that once felt heavy now carried shape and meaning, transforming from an emotional barrier into a space for reflection. Sandra no longer felt diminished by stepping back. She felt steadier, more aware of herself and her expectations. Keanu, in turn, felt more certain that when he did speak, it would not be to undo silence, but to give it purpose. Part 2 closes not with confrontation, but with quiet evolution. The distance between what is said and what is meant has grown visible, not as a divide, but as a space where understanding can form. The story is no longer about a single moment of silence, but about how two people, bound by respect and shared history, learn to navigate the unseen boundaries that define emotional maturity. And as that space continues to take shape, one truth becomes clear. The most powerful transformations rarely happen loudly. They unfold in the quiet moments we choose to face honestly. The invitation arrived without ceremony. A simple message suggesting coffee at a quiet place neither paparazzi nor memory favored. And Sandra Bullock read it twice before responding, not because she hesitated to meet, but because she understood the weight of accepting. The days since the silence had reshaped her interior landscape. She felt steadier now, less reactive, yet more honest with herself than she had been in years. When she agreed, she did so with intention, knowing that conversations postponed eventually return with greater urgency, and that clarity, once invited, asks for courage. She arrived early, choosing a table near the window where the light softened faces and made truth feel less confrontational, and she waited without rehearsing what she would say, trusting that what mattered would surface on its own. Keanu Reeves entered quietly, as he always did, not avoiding attention so much as refusing to invite it. He noticed the details, the way Sandra held her cup, the calm in her posture, the absence of tension in her smile, and he felt both relief and resolve. This was not a moment for apologies offered out of discomfort, nor explanations framed to soothe his own conscience. He sat across from her with the same respect that had guided his silence, understanding that if words were to come now, they needed to be precise, unguarded, and rooted in humility. The space between them felt different than before, not strained, but attentive, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to reveal its purpose. They spoke first of ordinary things,
not as avoidance but as acknowledgement of shared ground, letting familiarity re-establish a gentle rhythm. Then Sandra's gaze held his a fraction longer, and the conversation shifted without announcement. She spoke carefully, not accusing, not demanding, but honest in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. She explained how the silence had made her step back, not because she felt rejected, but because she felt uncertain, and uncertainty deserved respect rather than assumption. She admitted that she had realized something uncomfortable, yet freeing, that closeness, when unexamined, can quietly turn into expectation, and expectation, even when well-meaning, can cross boundaries without intention. Keanu listened without interruption, his expressions steady, receptive, and deeply present. When he spoke, it was not to defend the silence, but to give it context. He explained that his restraint had come from a desire to protect clarity, to ensure that kindness did not unintentionally create confusion or emotional debt. He spoke of responsibility, of how silence had been his way of preventing a narrative from forming that neither of them had chosen consciously. His words were measured, but not distant, and as he spoke, the silence that once separated them transformed into understanding, reshaping itself into a shared acknowledgement of maturity rather than a barrier of misunderstanding. The conversation did not crescendo into dramatic resolution. Instead, it deepened, unfolding layer by layer. Sandra felt something release inside her, not because she had been given answers, but because she had been met with honesty that honored her intelligence and autonomy. Keanu, in turn, felt relief, not in being forgiven, he had never sought that, but in knowing that respect had been received as it was intended. They both recognized that the silence had not been a failure of communication, but a pause that demanded intentional dialogue before moving forward. As they parted, there was no grand declaration, no promise to return to what once was, because both understood that growth rarely circles back, it moves forward with clearer vision. Sandra walked away feeling lighter, not diminished by the distance she had taken, but strengthened by the clarity she had gained. Keanu watched her leave with quiet gratitude, aware that the courage to speak after silence was as vital as the courage to remain silent when words could mislead. That evening, Alexandra Grant noticed the shift immediately when Keanu returned, not in his words, but in his presence. He spoke briefly of the meeting, not as a confession, but as an acknowledgement of alignment restored. Alexandra understood that the most meaningful resolutions rarely arrive with fanfare. They settle gently, like truth finally given room to breathe. She reminded him that respect is not static, it evolves through listening, through timing, and through the willingness to speak when silence has done all it can. Part 3 ends not with closure, but with transformation. The silence that once made Sandra step back has now done its work, carving out space for understanding that neither could have reached without it. The conflict has shifted from uncertainty to awareness, from tension to intention, setting the stage for what comes next, not a return to comfort, but a forward step into clarity, humility, and mutual respect. And as the story moves towards its final act, one truth stands firm. Real connection is not measured by how much is said, but how carefully words are chosen when they finally arrive.
Time did what no explanation ever could. It softened the sharp edges left behind by uncertainty and allowed meaning to settle where confusion once lived. In the weeks that followed their conversation, Sandra Bullock noticed a quiet shift within herself, not dramatic or announced, but steady and grounding. She no longer replayed the silence with lingering questions because it had already delivered what it was meant to teach her. She moved through her days with renewed clarity, recognizing how easily familiarity can blur into expectation and how growth often begins when one has the courage to step back without resentment. What she felt now was not distance, but perspective, and that perspective gave her a deeper respect for boundaries she had once assumed were already understood. For Keanu Reeves, the change manifested differently,
settling into a calm certainty that reaffirmed his belief in restraint guided by intention. He carried himself with the same humility he always had, yet with a quieter confidence that comes from knowing one has chosen integrity over convenience. The silence that once weighed on him no longer felt like something he needed to justify. It had served its purpose, allowing space for honesty to arrive without pressure or performance. He understood now that respect is not proven by constant reassurance, but by the willingness to honor another person's autonomy, even when doing so risks misunderstanding. Their next public appearance together unfolded without tension or spectacle, which made it more meaningful than any dramatic reconciliation ever could. They spoke warmly, exchanged genuine smiles, and moved with an ease that reflected not a return to old patterns, but an evolved understanding of one another. Observers saw nothing unusual, unaware that they were witnessing the result of emotional maturity quietly at work. There was no need for explanations, because the truth no longer required defense. It existed comfortably in the way they treated each other, with consistency, care, and an absence of assumption. Behind the scenes, Alexandra Grant observed these moments with quiet appreciation, recognizing how rarely people choose growth over narrative. She understood that respect, when practiced fully, does not seek validation or applause. It simply exists, shaping interactions in ways that feel natural rather than forced. The situation had not demanded sides or sacrifice. It had demanded honesty, patience, and the courage to allow silence to complete its work before filling it with words. Sandra found herself reflecting on the experience during a quiet evening at home, realizing how empowering it had been to step back without bitterness, to examine her own expectations without defensiveness. She recognized that resilience is not always about enduring hardship, but about being willing to learn from discomfort. The silence had not diminished her voice, it had refined it, reminding her that self-respect often reveals itself in how one responds rather than reacts. Keanu, too, reflected privately, understanding that kindness is not measured by constant availability, but by thoughtful presence. He had not withdrawn, he had chosen precision, and that choice had protected everyone involved from confusion that could have grown into regret. He felt grateful, not because the situation had resolved neatly, but because it had reinforced values he had spent a lifetime cultivating: humility, responsibility, and the courage to let actions speak when words might mislead. As the story draws to its close, the moral emerges not as a declaration, but as a lived truth. Silence, when guided by respect, is not avoidance, it is intention. Stepping back is not weakness, it is awareness. And growth does not always announce itself with dramatic change. It often arrives quietly, reshaping how people understand themselves and each other. The silence that once made Sandra step back ultimately gave both of them something far more lasting than reassurance: clarity rooted in mutual respect. This is not a story about loss or separation, but about emotional maturity and the power of choosing integrity over impulse. It reminds us that real strength lies in humility, that kindness sometimes speaks through restraint, and that the most meaningful connections are built not on assumption, but on understanding. And in that understanding, both silence and words find their rightful place, working together to honor the dignity of everyone involved.